Hello, my name is Javier Chagoya Lázaro, Chief Financial Officer with the City of Oxnard. This presentation is for the public hearing of the proposed annual budget of the City of Oxnard for fiscal year 25-26. Staff recommendation is that the City Council conduct a public hearing on the fiscal year 25-26 proposed budget for the City of Oxnard and provide staff direction regarding any adjustments to the proposed budget in preparation for final budget adoption on June 17, 2025. There are certain terms that are used through the presentation that are highlighted in this slide, and they are a good reference to better understand how the information is presented for fiscal year 25-26 budget. This table presents a consolidated view of the fiscal year 25-26 proposed budget with the revenues and expenditures for all the funds, as well as with the projected fund balance for fiscal year 25-26. We'll see a more detailed information for the general fund, measure all, the enterprise funds, and that are also highlighted here. As an introduction, the general fund is presented a balanced budget with revenues equal to the proposed expenditures, and the impact of the fund balance is basically driven by the activity that we're expecting in fiscal year 2025. The rest of the funds, they're all presenting in the current fiscal year 25-26 a decrease in fund balance driven by execution of capital projects. In the case of the wastewater fund, that is the most significant decrease in fund balance, that activity is going to be supported by state revolving fund loans that have already been approved, and they basically represent $88.6 million of low interest loans to support improvements on the wastewater plan. Overall, total revenues proposed for fiscal year 25-26 equal at $593 million, and overall expenditures equal $659 million for the fiscal year. As we mentioned earlier, some difference between expenditures and proposed revenues are funded through available fund balance. At the end of the fiscal year 25-26, the overall fund balance is expected to be $166 million. This table presents a comparison between the proposed budget 25-26 expenditures and the adopted 24-25 budget expenditures. On the operating funds, we can see that there's a decrease of almost $102 million. And that decrease is explained because there was a lot of one-time expenditures in fiscal year 24-25. In the case of the general fund, there were $20 million towards the payment of pension debt. And in the case of the enterprise funds, there was a few big capital projects, as well as the special revenue fund that included the Rice and Fifth Avenue overpass project that was appropriated in fiscal year 24-25. The bottom section, the capital funds, are recorded separately, and the activities of the capital fund get funded through the operating funds. But it requires an appropriation in order to recognize those expenses. When you combine the capital and the operating funds, the total city appropriations for fiscal year 25-26 are $706 million. In this table, we're just presenting a comparison of grant revenue between the proposed budget for fiscal year 25-26 and the adopted budget for fiscal year 24-25. We can see there's a decrease of $100 million, and that decrease is also related to the one-time events that it was included in fiscal year 24-25 for the funding of the Rice Avenue and Fifth Street Railroad Grade Separation projects that is funded through a state grant. That grant was recorded in fiscal year 24-25 and justified the big part of the decrease in grant revenue for fiscal year 25-26. After seeing the consolidated information on the revenue side, now we're going to be seeing in more detail some of the major funds of the city. For fiscal year 25-26, the proposed budget for the general fund revenue is going to be the first one that we're going to start looking into more detail. What we can see in this table is that the overall revenues for the general fund are proposed to be 243.6 million, an increase of 7.9 million over the adopted budget for fiscal year 24-25. The major drivers of that increase are property taxes that are increasing 3.1 million or 4.3%, and sales and use tax that includes Measure E, and the 1% from the Bradley Burns sales tax. Sales tax are going to increase almost 3.5 million, 3.1% in the fiscal year 25-26. Also increasing is miscellaneous income that includes interest that is received for the investments that the city has in different securities. That's offset by some decreases in overall transfers to support the pay for services. Again, overall revenue are projected to increase by 3.4% to $243.6 million for fiscal year 25-26. Now we're going to review in this table the overall expenditures by department that are proposed for fiscal year 25-26. The total expenditures are $243.6 million. They are matching the overall revenues that we saw in the previous slide. What this means from the expenditure side, overall, there's a decrease of almost $13 million of 5.1%. That's relatively to the one-time expenditures that were included in fiscal year 24-25, especially under the non-departmental section in the first row in this table, included $20 million toward the payment of pension debt that will be executed in this fiscal year. That's the main driver of that decrease of almost, that line alone represents a decrease of $32.8 million. We see an increase in the public works department of $10.2 million, 33.7%. And that's also, there's a change in the way we are now recording the projects in the general fund. In the fiscal year 24-25 budget, all the projects that are related to the general fund were recorded under non-departmental category. In this fiscal year 25-26, new projects now are recorded under public works department that is in charge of leading and implementing those projects. And that's driving some of the increase that you see in row 30. Overall, the operating expenditures are $243.6 million. Now, there's a certain amount of transfers of capital projects that are highlighted here. So the budget for capital projects is $10.1 million. Now, the bottom line in this table compares the operating expenditures in the adopted budget in fiscal year 24-25 with the operating expenditures for fiscal year 25-26. In this case, we see that the operating expenditures are increasing by $9 million or 4%. Now that we have seen the overall revenues and the overall expenditures for the general fund balance, but let's see what is the impact on the bottom line. So fiscal year 24-25 started the fiscal year with $72.7 million in available fund balance. And that includes all this one-time fund available to pay for the long-term pension debt. After we made those payments, the available fund balance at the end of projected fund balance at the end of the fiscal year 24-25 is going to be almost $55 million. For fiscal year 25-26, the revenues and expenditures represent the same amount, so we're expecting no change on the available fund balance at the end of the fiscal year. So that number, it will still remain the same at almost $55 million. The next fund that we're going to be looking with a little bit more detail is going to be the Measure O, or the half a cent sales tax fund. The overall revenue for fiscal year 25-26 is proposed at $19.9 million, with a slight decrease in sales and use tax, and driving the major decrease in revenue is the payment of the general fund loan to the measure of fund that it was completed in fiscal year 24-25. So that revenue is no longer available in fiscal year 25-26. Therefore, there's a decrease in overall revenue on the measure of fund of $1.7 million, of almost 8%. On the expenditure side, total expenditures are proposed at $29.2 million, an increase of almost $6.3 million or 27%. So that increase is driven by mostly by one-time projects that would have been funded by the general fund that now are being funded by Measure O. The overall activity for the fund in fiscal year 25-26 is a decrease of $9.3 million. That represents a change of almost $8 million with respect to the prior fiscal year. As a result of the expenditures being higher than the revenues, the measure of fund will see a decrease on the overall fund balance from expected $11.1 million at the end of fiscal year 24-25 to $1.9 million at the end of fiscal year 25-26. This fund balance still provide enough cushion with the future revenue to meet all the obligations for the measure of fund. We're transitioning now to the enterprise or utility funds, and we're going to start with the water fund revenue and expenses. For fiscal year 25-26, the proposed budget recognized $73.6 million in revenue. That's almost $2.7 million more than the prior fiscal year adopted budget, or 3.8% increase. At the same time, on the overall expenses for this group of funds, it's $75.2 million, a decrease of $6.3 million, or 7.7% with respect to the adopted budget in fiscal year 24-26. The major driver of this reduction is in the transfers out by $7.6 million, and that includes the capital projects that basically that were budgeted in fiscal year 24-25, and for fiscal year 25-26, they're just not, the number of projects is being reduced. We see, on the other hand, an increase in the capital expenditure line for equipment acquisition, that increasing by $1 million. Overall, the net activity for these water funds is a reduction fund balance of $1.6 million with, for the fiscal year. With that reduction net activity that we just saw, the fund balance that is estimated for at the end of fiscal year 25-26 for the water funds is $10.5 million, and that is basically $7.6 million below the reserve target of 25% for the enterprise funds. The next enterprise funds that we're going to be highlighting is the wastewater funds group. Overall revenue for fiscal year 25-26 proposed budget is $45 million, with proposed expenses of $87.5 million for a net activity of a reduction of fund balance of $42.4 million. That represents, in the case of the revenues represent a decrease of almost $50.6 million with respect to the adopted budget in fiscal year 24-25. That reduction is driven by, because fiscal year 24-25 included under miscellaneous income revenue related to the state revolving fund loan. In the case of the expenditures, we see a decrease of $10.6 million with respect to the adopted budget in fiscal year 24-25. That reduction in the line 59 of transfers out is mostly driven by the projected capital expenditures for fiscal year 25-26 being lower than the one anticipated in fiscal year 24-25. As we mentioned in the previous slide, there's a decrease of almost $42 million on the overall fund activity in the wastewater funds due to the project execution. And that decrease is supported by, we have mentioned this as well, by the state revolving fund loans. So as we receive those funds becomes available to pay for projects. And we're expecting an overall reduction of fund balance from $73.9 million to $31.4 million at the end of fiscal year 25-26. That fund balance represents a reduction or below the City Council approved reserve target of 25% by $4.8 million. The next fund that we're going to discuss is the Environmental Resources Fund, that is in charge of solid waste management in the city. And overall revenues for fiscal year 25-26 are estimated at $68.7 million, and overall expenditures at $69.7 million, with a net activity of a reduction of fund balance of $1 million. When we compare the proposed activity for fiscal year 25-26 with the adopted budget for fiscal year 24-25, revenue represent an increase of $9.5 million, or 16%. And that revenue is driven by the rates adopted by City Council. Total expenses and increasing like $6.7 million, or 10.6%, and are mostly driven on the transfer act section with the acquisition of equipment for the enterprise, this Environmental Resources Fund. Again, overall, the net activity for the projected for fiscal year 25-26 is a reduction of fund balance by $1 million. As we mentioned, with the reduction of that net activity, the impact on the overall fund balance, it will be a reduction of $1 million that will bring the fund balance for the estimated $12.5 million at the end of fiscal year 24-25 to an estimated $11.4 million at the end of fiscal year 24-26. That amount is basically $4.6 million below the 25% reserve target that the City Council established through the reserve policy. The next table represents the activity of the Gold Fund with the proposed budget for fiscal year 25-26, compare again against the adopted budget for 24-25 and the revised budget for 24-25. Total revenue for fiscal year 25-26 is estimated at $6.9 million, almost $7 million, an increase of $422,000. This revenue is based on the new agreement that the city has signed with the American Golf Corporation to manage the golf course. On total expenses for fiscal year 25-26 represents $6.5 million, a decrease of $768,000 over the adopted budget for fiscal year 24-25. The reduction is mostly driven by the capital projects that were budgeted in fiscal year 24-25. The result of these revenue and expenses is a net activity of increase in fund balance on this for the Gold Fund by almost $500,000. The projected fund balance at the end of fiscal year 24-25 is $5.4 million. And with this additional $500,000 increase that we are projecting for fiscal year 25-26, we'll estimate that the available fund balance at the end of that fiscal year will be $5.9 million for the Gold Fund. Staff recommendation is that the City Council conduct a public hearing on the fiscal year 25-26 proposed budget for the City of Oxnard and provide staff direction regarding any adjustments to the proposed budget in preparation for final budget adoption on June 17, 2025. This concludes the presentation. Thank you.